think of partnerships like an iceberg. When you see the tip of the iceberg, you've all heard that basically the majority of it sits below the waterline. The deal that gets done is the tip of the iceberg. The amount of work that should go into that deal is a piece that's generally hidden below the waterline. I'll claim now what my bias is just before I get into it. My premise is if you're just starting out, relatively new, let's say you're an entrepreneur or a part-time entrepreneur, you may underestimate the amount of time it takes to get into, find the right partnership, to go through deal negotiations, contracting, and probably, if you're like most people, you completely underestimate the complexity and challenges of actually activating or executing the partnership you spent so long pulling together. I'm hoping in the short amount of time I've got, just give you some do's and don'ts on how you should be focusing your time, what you should be preparing for if you're going to go down this journey, which can be really worthwhile. The first is partnerships can be really amazing. In a lot of ways, the use of partnerships through negotiation can be a great growth hack for your business. Ultimately, partnerships can be a black hole. It can compress time and space between you and the markets you want to get to. That's how to think about partnerships. You've already got an established strategy. You know the market you want to get to. What you're really, really wrestling with is finding the time, money, or people to get there on your own. That's when you need to start thinking about partnerships. When you read about partnerships and you see partnerships in the press, what you're probably seeing more of are multinational enterprises building up incubated sessions, finding ways to on-ramp smaller companies. Really cool. Looks great for a press release. There's always a founder with a smile and a paycheck, but more often than not, they are more disappointed founders than not. Typically, a small business trying to use partnerships to grow more quickly has a very different strategic intent from a very large business trying to find on the cheap and quickly R&D that they can fold into their business, potential resources, maybe even talent. It's not that you shouldn't do it. It's that you shouldn't think that you struck gold. You should think that you've just had to start digging to find out, to make sure all the terms and conditions are right for you. I'm not talking about how to negotiate specifically against MNEs, but I'm happy to talk about it through Q&A or any follow-ups. Partnerships typically take the form of alliances, JVs, and acquisitions. Think about those as a sequential linear pathway. You can do a general alliance or partnership first. It can lead to a JV, which can lead to an acquisition. You don't have to jump necessarily to the very end, and one doesn't necessarily preclude the other. Typically, in my experience, if you start with a partnership or alliance that's well negotiated and well thought out, you're in a much better position to move from a position of strength into a JV or an acquisition, just for what it's worth. But hey, everyone talks about how great they are. They can be great, but they're not all great for everyone. I was at Microsoft when a lot of this happened. Back in 2011, a great deal between Microsoft and Nokia. If you're remotely reading the business press or in the space, you would have heard about this. You shouldn't get too excited that Steve Ballmer's smiling. He's always smiling or yelling or something. It's not such a big deal. But within a short order, which was a good thing, they thought, Microsoft went to a buy. So from a general alliance to an acquisition, $7.2 billion. I'm pretty sure that was US, so not bad. All within a relatively short period of time, basically 1.5 years to 2 years. But then Microsoft wrote off technically almost the full value based on this print, basically more than the value of the acquisition. So even when some of the biggest companies in the world get together, even when they spend years trying to slide through partnerships to JVs to acquisitions, they can be brutally bad. Not just in terms of misalignment, bad PR, but financially. I think that was the worst quarter Microsoft had in about 31 years. I didn't do that deal. I wasn't part of that deal. I don't feel bad about it, but I was lucky enough to have been in the stand, so I can talk a little bit about the things that maybe you can not do to go forward that helps you a little bit, and learnings from the big ones. Think of partnerships like an iceberg. When you see the tip of the iceberg, you've all heard that basically the majority of it sits below the waterline. The deal that gets done is the tip of the iceberg. The amount of work that should go into that deal is a piece that's generally hidden below the waterline. There's a bunch of things I think you should think about. First of all, you really want to think really hard about your strategy. Increasingly, and I've run into it with different clients, is there tends to be kind of a feeding frenzy on partnerships. The more, the merrier. The more press releases that go out, the better. As most of you know, if you've been through the cycle a couple times, you read your press release, the partner reads the press release, your friends and family do, but really not many other people. It's very hard to have a significant impact in the marketplace just through a press release, just through a partnership. So you want to make sure that strategically you spend some time on it. A couple key points. Partnership should be one of many reasons for going to market in a particular way. Make sure you don't jump quickly to partnerships, but think about it against at least one or two similarly strategic ideas for going into the market, and find a way to quantify the differences between the two. As a smaller business, never partner to build out new services, only partner to build out the core business. You can't afford the distraction. You won't be able to append the new services in a timely enough way. And it's really your core business that you've got your founding intelligence, probably most of your history and capabilities as well. Ultimately, when you're trying to express the benefits of a partnership, if you can't say in writing and convince yourself that within 12 months you're going to improve customer satisfaction, get customers, existing customers, to adopt your product or service more quickly or generate higher returns, or two of those three, don't do it. It's only going to create more of a distraction, potentially also a significant investment of money or time you don't have in addition without the benefit. Typically, you should think about a partnership, if you're going through of it, a bit like an organ transplant. It should be a significant addition, appendage to the body of your organization. That means structurally a lot of things need to work out pretty well. Too often it can be driven by a single person versus a mix of people within a particular business unit. Always make sure there's at least two involved. The statement around appropriate leadership, incentives, tracking, and time for partner integration, what that fundamentally means is it needs to be a senior person driving that at a fairly senior visible level all the way through. I can show a bit more about timing as I go through the deck, but typically in my experience, people underestimate by at least half the amount of energy it's going to take just to find a suitable partner. That doesn't include actually going through the integration of the partner's business or service area. When you're thinking about the leader for something related to this, if it's not you as the founder, it typically, if you're at just a mid-sized organization, typically the leader should be within the business units that's most affected, but almost as importantly, culturally, from a mindset perspective, they need to really understand how your organization works and probably be the most involved or the most knowledgeable on how your internal processes work. Back to the example of an organ transplant, it's really got to fit within the circulatory system of your organization at a really detailed level. I'd say 7 times out of 10, you get a false negative on a failed partnership. It was really a good idea. You know, you did do your homework, but when it came down to making sure that the flow of information and resources worked appropriately through the you and the partner, it falls down to just the little bits of disaggregation around the processes and the data flow and approvals. And then from a metrics perspective, at the end of the day, where people often fall down when they're doing the forecasting on the value of the partnerships, and something that needs to be taken into account for the metrics, is there should be a baseline revenue attachment, but also an incentive attachment. At the end of the day, you should be able to forecast basically an even flow or moderate view of what the revenue should look like. But for the people responsible for the partnership, realistically, and probably for the partner too, you need to use revenue incentives to guide them towards like the highest return on the partnership possible. Too often, when partnerships are pulled together, one of the reasons the other entity is interested is they're thinking similarly. They want to be doing something a little bit different. They plan on adding something, trying to do something a little bit differently, as I said. unless there's shared financial incentives for both parties to get to that new level of growth, one of the parties won't be able to get there, which tends to be the downfall of the partnership as well. What's an example of the level of detail that can occur? I had to do an internal update when I was at Microsoft. We tend to try and use visual and color cues as much as possible. People are just so inundated with numbers. This was something I tried to show from a timing perspective on the different stages as a partnership. The new normal at the division I was at, called advertising and online, was partnerships weren't taking 3 months, they were taking 13 months. I had to, as a relatively new person, I got to bring the good news to the organization that we're falling down on this piece in particular. And in one project in particular that I was updating the management team on, which I called a labor of love because it certainly didn't feel like I was getting any practical return on all the energy, was it took me basically 12 to 13 months from initial strategy approval all the way through to a projected actual collection of revenues for the organization at the very end. This is something where my predecessor would have said it would have taken maybe a month or two. The reason I point it out is to say, even for a really big organization that's supposed to be really good at this, and I'd say we probably were, to tell you the truth, it can take an unbearable amount of time realistically to get all the way through with something that's completely approved, supported, forecasts every which way from Sunday, but still by the time it gets to kind of the integration pieces, which tend to be overly complicated and grind up against existing processes, if you're not forecasting at least anything close to a year, a bit more, it can be hard. Granted, it's like a suit. Every person may wear a slightly different size, but if you start from the premise this is going to take a long time, you'll be pleasantly surprised when it doesn't, and you'll probably because you put the right efforts in place to make sure you can achieve it in a reasonable time frame. What kind of forecast do you need to have? This isn't giving away too much. This is just a snippet of some of the information I needed to play with. This is stale now in case there's anyone from the organization listening, so it doesn't matter at the end of the day. But typically in this instance, it was about trying to find appropriate partners for one of our services and online advertising, where we thought there was going to be a relationship between the large companies divesting in print communication, moving towards digital. We had lots of data. I came up with a cool algorithm, although it was fairly straightforward. What I loved is it printed a little bubble chart off to the side without me having to do too much extra work, and I was able to benchmark it versus an industry norm across each of the different companies. This was standard for me, just to have someone say, okay, you can go after them now. That would make sense to collect partners to see if we can get this new service line going in Canada. That didn't take a particularly long time. What it took was an understanding that without the data, I wouldn't have an appropriate guide for the types of organizations I needed to be talking to, and that I'd probably have more trouble than not within the organization convincing people that I should be spending more time with one organization versus another. If you're an organization of two, unless you really don't like your co-founder, you won't have the discussion there, but what you will have is constantly trying to deflect the ongoing distractions you have in managing your business. There's always something new and exciting coming along. If you have the data and you have a bit of a timeline, you're going to find it a lot easier to say no to the things that aren't going to fulfill your strategy at the end of the day. And that'll be one of the better ways of getting to the right kind of partnership and the right timing that'll make the biggest impact on your business. Deal due diligence, just some quick learnings. If we think about time and effort, which is probably the biggest thing, the assumption is time is not inexhaustible. It's finite, but it's relatively free if you're working for yourself. Or if this is your position, you're being paid to do it anyways. These are all the different things you need to do. They should be the greatest exertion of effort going top to bottom. They're going to take a fairly large amount of time going left and right. What's equally strategic is figuring out what are the right strategies and which partnerships are going to be a viable solution. If I'm going to go do partnerships, I shouldn't just think of the easiest thing, but a group of things that are going to help me to get there, et cetera, et cetera. If I think about the non-disclosure agreement, then the couple rounds of negotiations that are critical, including governance with the new partner to ensure that you've proactively figured out how to manage the natural discomfort and disruption in both organizations to be talking about working more together. That should be the bulk of your time. The other piece that becomes highly critical tends to be all the operational pieces. There's an infinite amount of detail on how you execute a partnership depending on the organization, the partnership, the structure, a whole bunch of other things. But ultimately, you should spend as much time on the integration and execution as you did on the planning. The piece that I can confidently say you should spend the least amount of time on is the legal. And respectfully for any of the lawyers in the room, I think you'd agree. What you don't want to do is negotiate the business terms for your client. What you want to do is contract the business terms your client has agreed to with the partner. If you bring your lawyer in too soon, and we had a great legal firm with Osler for Canada, for Microsoft, even their most senior people that I got the pleasure of working with agree is, you don't want to pay for me until you're really sure what you want to get done with the partner. The second piece you really need to keep in mind ultimately is that a good lawyer defends you at all costs, which becomes antagonistic for the other party ultimately too. So you really benefit ultimately by spending as much time as possible going through the terms before you bring in legal. A final point, and this was meant to be a build slide, but something just to think about, it'll finish in a second, is what people do too often is they do sometimes a partnership at a time. They don't create a partnership ecosystem, and it's something to think about. When I was working for MSN International in London, England, we decided we needed to get into this online sports content business, and it couldn't be a more congested, competitive arena. On the one hand, the most passionate viewers and consumers of content across any device are sports fans. The beauty is it is an infinite and unending, or an infinite and engaging series of content across all the sports, across all the games, across all the championships, across all the personalities. It's fantastic when you think about running a web business and trying to think about what's a category that's going to just give me a waterfall of information on a regular basis that I can just kind of spoon out the pieces I want. Problem was we had no credibility whatsoever in sports, and we kind of built that up. And we had a clever way of getting around it. But the bigger thing was, what we knew was at the end of the day was that we would never have, quite honestly, hardcore sports content enthusiasts. But what we would have were kind of the bench warmers, we call them. These are the people that tend to come out at championship games or through playoffs when they get really exciting, when it's no longer sports, it's a social activity. All of a sudden, everyone on the floor wants to talk about the team or the team's wives or the team's husbands or the team's this or the team's that. And it's really exciting. And you want as much social interactivity as possible. And despite the fact it was a super large company and this was a strategic project, you never have as much money as you want, even as a really large company, just for what it's worth. And the question got to be, we're never going to be able to build it all the social interacting type of devices, games, social interaction, software we want. And we quite honestly didn't have the resources or the time to go and do a onesies, twosies on partners. So I ended up coming up with a more integrated partner ecosystem. And the simple thinking is this. You can create a neighborhood of partners as long as you can build a lead partner ecosystem. Fundamentally, if you build up a series of partnerships into a cluster, if you have in mind that one of them needs to manage the rest of them, like this version on the far right-hand side, then instead of you managing the 4, you're managing the 1, and you just tier your metrics accordingly, which allows you to do a whole bunch of things. Most importantly, is you can start building out the next round, which fundamentally helps the business and will help your career at some point, too, if you're with a larger organization, and will help your business if you're one of the smaller ones who's associated with the partnership. There's a way to think about partner plurality systems along the same way. So plurality strategy, structure, and metrics. I'd say fundamentally, think of it as an iceberg. More than 2/3 of the work should be up front, and then another 2/3, and I know that's more than a third, should be at the back end realistically, but it should be a barbell of activity with realistically the legal piece and just sitting in the middle.